If you are a pre-K project or site director, then you will be responsible for maintaining your program's grant requirement checklist. The grant requirement checklist is a document that helps you track and monitor the completion of program requirements throughout the entire school year. Most frequently, the grant requirement checklist and accompanying documentation can be filed and organized in a notebook. You could also use a filing system with folders. But today I do have a sample grant requirement checklist notebook that I'm going to show you so that you can see how to set it up and how to organize the documentation that you need to collect throughout the school year. The first thing you will need to do is go to the DECAL website and print yourself a copy of the Grant Requirement Checklist. The Grant Requirement Checklist, or GRC, is the document that is used to help directors track program requirements. It is in 3 sections. Section 1 are responsibilities carried out by the project director. Section 2 are responsibilities carried out by the site director. And then Section 3 outlines responsibilities that will be shared by both the project and the site director. For Section 3, projects and site directors will need to work together to determine who is going to complete each item, and then documentation will be maintained in this notebook for the site. Okay? I would also like to point out that when we organize our GRC notebook and accompanying documentation, we're going to organize it in the order it appears on the checklist, and each item is going to get its own individual section in the notebook. I also have available on my Google Pre-K resource portal divider pages that you can use to help you organize your documentation. You can see this divider page I printed out on a piece of colored paper and I put into a page protector, and this is acting as my divider. It tells me the section that I'm looking at, and behind it will be the required documentation. There is a divider page for each individual section or each individual item under each section of the GRC. Okay? You can print the GRC from the DECAL website. Available there are some additional resources like a table of contents for your GRC notebook if you wish to print and use that as well. So let's jump in and start looking at each individual item under each section. Section 1 are program responsibilities. These are things carried out by the project director. The first thing is training for both leads and assistants. There's a section for lead teacher training documents. You could put their registration confirmation email here. You could also put their stamped attendance page if they attended a live session, or their certificate of completion. So I have a sample of a proof of attendance, a stamped attendance page from a live training session. But if they're only going to virtual sessions this year, that's fine. After they're completed, they can go into Georgia PDS and print a copy of their certificate of completion for their training session. You will need to make sure that you have a certificate on file for each lead teacher. The next section is about assistant teachers, and you will want to make sure you do the same thing for each assistant teacher here. You can print the confirmation email, or you can print and have a copy of the stamped attendance page from a live session, or the certificate of completion that they print once they have completed their virtual training sessions. Project directors will also need to be trained. New project directors are required to attend training. Once training is available and you have registered, you can print your registration confirmation, or when you have completed your training requirements, you can print those certificates from your Georgia PDS account and put those here behind this section for project and site directors. The next section under Section 1 is the Georgia PDS profile. You will have a copy of the profile report for each individual lead and assistant teacher. So you will see here is a sample of what the profile report looks like. The next section under Section 1 is documentation for disenrollment. There will be no disenrollment without prior approval from the start office. Documentation is required to disenroll a child, and if that ever happens, which it rarely does, but if it happens, you will maintain your documentation in this section. Next, we have Section 2, and these are responsibilities of the site directors. that will be specific to each location, each individual school. So the first thing that site directors are responsible for is making sure that parents receive an orientation at the beginning of the school year. You will want to document parent participation in parent orientation. You can document by having a sign-in sheet and possibly an agenda of items that you discussed during the parent orientation. The next section is specific to student files. So the first thing it's going to ask you to do is maintain a working copy of the pre-K checklist for student files. That document can be downloaded from the DCAL website. And you will write each child's name in the class and track your progress of collecting required documentation from the family. You need to have one checklist in the notebook for each individual class. The checklist should be updated as new students arrive during each roster cycle. This next section says that each individual student will have a file on site. Most of the time, the student files are not kept here in this section of the notebook. They might be kept in a different notebook, or maybe they're kept in the vault in the main office of your school. But what you could do here is put a document here that says individual student files are housed, and then tell where they are located. For this sample, I've said that they're housed in the vault located in the registrar's office, and this would suffice for showing that you have student files for each child, and they're on site, they're just not located here inside this notebook. The next thing that site directors are responsible for monitoring is attendance and attendance documentation. If attendance documentation is maintained in Infinite Campus or in Power School, you could certainly have a note about that on a page right here, much like I had in the last section that says attendance documentation is in Infinite Campus. But if you are using handwritten attendance documentation, you would want to have a copy or a printout of a regular attendance report. You would also want to document where you have followed up with families on any sort of attendance issues or concerns that you might have about individual student attendance. So you might also want to put your attendance policy here, how you are following up with families, whether it's a phone call or a letter from the school. And then you could certainly put a copy of your class's attendance printout for the month, and any documentation of how you're following up with families, and maybe keep a log when you're following up with children who are having problematic attendance issues. The next section is section 3, and this outlines responsibilities that the project and the site directors will share. So projects and site directors need to confer and figure out what each of these items is going to look like at your location. The first thing is staff orientation. Some programs get all the teachers together from all sites at one time and do staff orientation together. Some programs have individual staff orientations. Whatever works for your program, but you need to have it before the 20th day of school, and you want to make sure that you maintain a sign-in sheet of the teachers that attended orientation, as well as a copy of an agenda of items that were discussed during the orientation. The next thing that needs to be maintained on site is documentation of suspension of children. If you have children that have to be suspended because they are causing harm to themselves or others, then you need to make sure that you send that Appendix E to your pre-K specialist as soon as you possibly can. And then you will also send a copy to the project director and put a copy of that Appendix E here in your notebook. Section 3 also helps directors monitor classroom components specific for monitoring teacher items and things like that. So the first thing that we're going to look at under Section 3 is appropriate lesson plans. It's the site director's job to make sure that there are appropriate lesson plans on site and that they're checked regularly. At the beginning of the school year, within the first 30 days, teachers will complete the IQ guide for planning instruction, and they will attach a copy of those lesson plans that they reviewed to the IQ guide. You need to make sure that you have one IQ guide for every class. The next thing says that you need to have a written plan for monitoring those lesson plans and giving feedback. And you want to include in your monitoring plan who is going to review each item, the lesson plans, how often will lesson plans be reviewed, what tools will be used, and how will feedback be provided. I have a sample monitoring plan here. It says teachers will complete lesson plans by Thursday of each week, and the directors will review and provide feedback. It does not have to be a long plan, just it could be a numbered list or a bulleted list or a short paragraph. But what are you doing to monitor lesson plans? Next is the daily schedule. You want to make sure that every teacher has an appropriate daily schedule on site. Teachers will submit a copy of the IQ guide for daily schedule and attach a copy of their daily schedule to you for review. Every individual teacher will complete this and submit. The next item is learning environment. At the beginning of the year, within the first 30 days, each teacher will need to complete a copy of the IQ guide for learning environment. And this can be stored here, this document, one for each individual class. The teacher will do a review of her own classroom, and then a designated reviewer will also review and then submit this to the notebook. There also does need to be a written plan for monitoring the classroom environment, materials, and providing follow-up. In this plan, who's going to review the environment, how often will it be reviewed, what tools or resources will be utilized, and how will feedback be provided. Here's a sample plan that says the director will walk through the classroom every 2 weeks. The director will ensure that the environment is organized, free of clutter, and you can see the next few steps that the director will take to ensure that all items are appropriate in the learning environment. Again, this does not have to be a long plan. It could be a bulleted list or a short paragraph that describes your process for checking the learning environment. The next and final section is the assessment requirements for your program. So site directors and project directors will work together to ensure that appropriate child assessment is implemented for each child. There are 2 IQ guides for assessment. There's one specific to directors, and it has the timeline of things that the directors will do throughout the school year to make sure that teachers are implementing WSO. There's an IQ guide for the fall, and then there is also one for the spring for directors. There is one for the teachers for the fall that outlines their weekly things to do and the things they have to do at the end of the rating period. And then here's the teacher's IQ guide for the spring as well. The very last item that you have to think about as a project or site director is how are you going to monitor assessment. So you need a monitoring plan for assessment. That will include who will be the designated reviewer, when and how often will WSO be reviewed, the tools or resources that will be utilized, and how feedback will be provided. And since you have this IQ guide for directors, it's already built in for you with the timeline of when you will look at each item, you can use this as part of your monitoring plan. So my sample monitoring plan here says that directors will use the director's IQ guide for assessment to monitor WSO. Directors will log into WSO using the timeline provided on the IQ guide. They will ensure that teachers are entering evidence and have started checklists by the appropriate dates, and feedback will be provided in writing. So this is a very short, simple way to outline how you're going to monitor assessment. And that is the final section of the GRC notebook. So I hope that this video has helped you in getting your notebook set up and understanding what each section means and what each document looks like. If you have questions, please contact your pre-K specialist for clarification.